The first thing I noticed was her hands. She was kneeling beside me on the grass, her fingers wrapped around my wrist, trying to unclasp something. My vision was blurred at the edges, the way it gets when you've been asleep too long in a strange position. Except, I hadn't been asleep. I'd been sitting on a bench in Riverside Park, watching the morning joggers pass, drinking my coffee from the thermos I always brought on Tuesdays. And then everything had simply gone dark. "What are you doing?" My voice came out rougher than I intended. "Get your hands off me." She pulled back immediately, both palms raised. She looked to be in her mid-50s, silver hair pulled into a bun, wearing a green cardigan despite the September warmth. Her eyes were calm, not startled, not guilty. Calm in a way that made me feel like I was the one who had done something wrong. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm a retired cardiologist. I was sitting on that bench over there when you collapsed. I came to help." She paused. "I was trying to remove your smartwatch." I looked down at my wrist. The watch was still there. Black face, thin band. A gift from my daughter, 8 months ago. A gift she had said would change my life. "Why?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment before she answered. "Because I've seen a device like that before," she said quietly. "And the man who was wearing it had the same symptoms you just had." I didn't know what to say to that. A small crowd had gathered a few feet away. The kind of polite American circle that forms around an emergency, close enough to help, far enough to pretend they aren't staring. Someone had already called 911. I could hear the siren in the distance. "I'm fine," I said, mostly to myself. But I wasn't fine. And somewhere underneath the fog that was still clearing from my head, I think I already knew it. "My name is Gerald. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as an orthopedic surgeon at Northwestern Memorial, retired 2 years ago when my wife passed, and the work stopped feeling like anything at all. My daughter, who I'll call Claire, is 34. She's an attorney, sharp, organized, the kind of person who has a plan for everything and a backup plan for the backup plan. She got that from her mother. I always admired it in both of them. After my wife died, Claire started calling more. Every day, sometimes twice. She flew in from Phoenix 3 times in the first year. She cooked for me, organized my medications, hired a cleaning service for the house. I told her I didn't need all of it. She told me I didn't know what I needed. I thought she was grieving. I thought the attention was her way of processing the loss. Losing your mother at 32 is a particular kind of pain, and I gave her every allowance in the world for it. I would have given her anything. Last January, she arrived at my door with a small white box. "I got you something," she said, settling into the kitchen chair the way she always did, one leg folded under her, like she was 12 years old again. "For your health." Inside the box was a smartwatch. Sleek, expensive-looking, with a black silicone band and a display that could show heart rate, blood oxygen, sleep patterns, stress levels. Claire pulled out her phone and showed me the companion app she'd already downloaded. She could see my readings in real time, she explained. She could monitor my heart rate trends, get alerts if anything looked unusual, track my sleep quality from across the country. "You'll feel better knowing someone is watching out for you," she said. "And I'll feel better too." I put it on that same afternoon. She showed me how to wear it snug against the skin for accurate readings. She reminded me 3 times before she flew home to keep it charged, keep it on. I was a surgeon for 3 decades. I understood monitoring equipment. I found the whole thing reassuring. Honestly, my wife had died of a cardiac event we hadn't seen coming. And the fear of that happening to me alone, in this house, with no one to find me, was something I carried quietly every single day. The watch felt like a tether to the world. It felt like my daughter's hand reaching across 1,200 miles to hold on to mine. That was January. By March, I was tired in a way I couldn't explain. Not sad tired, not grief tired, though I knew both of those well enough. This was physical. A heaviness in my chest that came and went without pattern. Occasional dizziness when I stood too quickly. A racing heart at odd moments, sitting at my desk, lying in bed. Once while eating breakfast and reading the paper, I mentioned it to Claire on one of our calls. "That's why I got you the watch, Dad," she said. I've been seeing some irregular patterns in your data. I was actually going to bring it up. I think you should see a cardiologist. She had already found one. A Dr. Harmon in Chicago, someone she'd located through a colleague. She made the appointment herself and texted me the details before we'd even finished the conversation. Dr. Harmon reviewed the data Claire had shared from the Watch app, weeks of readings, trends, flagged irregularities. He was thorough. He ordered a stress test, an echocardiogram, a Holter monitor for 2 weeks. The results, he said, were inconclusive. Mild arrhythmia, possibly stress-related, possibly age-related. He wanted to start me on a low-dose beta blocker and see me again in 60 days. I asked him if he thought this was serious. The data suggests your heart is working harder than it should be, he said. Let's get you regulated and see where we are. I started the beta blocker, I told Claire. She seemed relieved, but not surprised. My friend of 20 years, a man named Howard who taught philosophy at DePaul and had a talent for saying uncomfortable things plainly, took me to lunch in April and told me I looked like a different person. Different how? I asked. Smaller, he said. You look like you've been slowly turned down. I brushed it off. I told him about the arrhythmia, the medication, the adjustments. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Howard. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Does Claire know you're having lunch with me today? He asked. I thought about it. She did. She'd called that morning and I'd mentioned it, and she'd said something about how she was glad I was getting out but that I should try not to overdo it, given how I'd been feeling. Why do you ask? I said. Howard looked at his coffee cup. No reason, he said. But his jaw was tight in a way I recognized. He called me the next morning. He said he'd been thinking about our conversation and he wanted to say something, and he hoped I wouldn't take it the wrong way. He said that over the past several months, every time he'd tried to make plans with me, there had been a reason it didn't work. I was tired. I wasn't feeling well. Claire was visiting. I had an appointment. He said he couldn't remember the last time I'd come to one of the philosophy department's open lectures, something I had attended religiously for years. He said he was worried. I told him he was overthinking it. I said I'd been having real health issues and he was connecting dots that weren't connected. But after I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time and I thought about the last 8 months. I thought about the fact that I had declined more invitations than I'd accepted, that I had stopped going to the pool on Friday mornings, that I had missed my college roommate's retirement party in Boston, because Claire had been visiting that weekend and I hadn't wanted to leave her alone in the house, which, now that I examined it, made very little sense. That evening, Claire called at her usual time. She asked about my day, my meals, whether I'd taken my medication. She asked if I'd worn the watch all day. Of course, I said. Good, she said. Your resting heart rate was elevated this afternoon. Around 2:30. Were you stressed about something? I looked at the clock. It was 2:30 that I'd been sitting at the kitchen table, thinking about Howard's call. I was just sitting, I said. Try to rest more, she said. I mean it, Dad. You push yourself too hard. I said goodnight and set the phone down and sat with a feeling I didn't have a name for yet. The morning I collapsed in Riverside Park was a Tuesday in September. I had walked there from the house, maybe 8 blocks, something I'd done hundreds of times over the years. I sat on my usual bench, poured my coffee, watched a woman run past with a golden retriever. I remember thinking that the sky was a particular shade of blue that my wife had loved, that sharp October approaching blue that turns the whole city luminous. And then I woke up on the ground. The paramedics arrived and checked my vitals and told me my blood pressure was very low. They wanted to take me in. I let them. In the ER, a young doctor reviewed my chart, noted the beta blocker, noted the reported arrhythmia, drew blood. He was courteous and careful and ultimately sent me home with instructions to follow up with Dr. Harmon. Claire called while I was still in the ER. She had received an alert from the Watch app. She was upset, which I understood, and she spent most of the call telling me I needed to be more careful, that this was exactly what she had been worried about, that she was looking at flights. You don't need to fly out, I said. Dad, you passed out in a public park. I'm fine. The doctors said I'm fine. The doctors said your blood pressure was critically low. Her voice was controlled, but underneath it was something else. Something I had always read as fear. I'm coming Thursday. Don't argue with me. I didn't argue. I hung up and lay in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the woman in the green cardigan. I thought about what she had said. I've seen a device like that before, and the man who was wearing it had the same symptoms you just had. I had taken her card before the ambulance arrived. Margaret Osei, MD, retired. A phone number. I called her the next morning. She answered on the second ring, as though she'd been expecting it. We met at a coffee shop on Clark Street, far enough from my neighborhood that I told myself I was being ridiculous. That this was nothing. That I was becoming the kind of old man who sees conspiracies and coincidences. I wore the watch. I noticed, sitting across from her, that she looked at it immediately when I walked in. She was direct. I appreciated that. She told me that 2 years ago, she had treated a patient, a retired engineer in his late 60s who had been experiencing progressive cardiac symptoms that didn't fully align with his history. Low blood pressure, fatigue, intermittent arrhythmia. He wore a consumer smartwatch given to him by his son. When Margaret had examined the device alongside a colleague who specialized in biomedical engineering, they had found that the watch was emitting a very low-frequency electrical current, enough to be imperceptible to the wearer, but enough, with sustained daily exposure, to disrupt the body's own electrical system, the autonomic nervous system, the signals that regulate heart rate and blood pressure. It's not a common thing, she said. It's not something most people have any reason to look for. Consumer devices aren't tested for this kind of sustained low-level exposure over months. She paused. His son had modified the device. I set my coffee cup down. The son wanted control of the father's estate, she said. The father had recently changed his will. The modification was sophisticated, not something available commercially. It required expertise. She folded her hands on the table. The father survived. The son is serving 8 years. I looked down at the watch on my wrist. I could be wrong, Margaret said. I want to be clear about that. This could be a coincidence. Your arrhythmia could be exactly what your cardiologist believes it is. She met my eyes. But I thought you deserved to know what I've seen. I drove home with the watch sitting on the passenger seat. I hadn't taken it off so much as I'd simply removed it in the coffee shop, sliding it across the table toward Margaret without thinking about it. She had taken it gently, without comment. I walked into my house and I sat in the armchair by the window, and I tried to be a reasonable person. I tried to approach this the way I had approached difficult diagnoses for 30 years, with evidence, with logic, with the understanding that the most alarming explanation is rarely the correct one. But I was also a doctor, and I knew, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives when you've been avoiding a conclusion, that I had felt unwell for exactly as long as I had been wearing that watch. Not before. Not during the 2 weeks after my wife died, when I barely slept or ate and the grief was a physical weight on my sternum. Not during the first hard year of retirement. After the watch, Claire arrived Thursday evening with 2 rolling suitcases and a bag of groceries. She had already scheduled a follow-up with Dr. Harmon for the following Monday. She had printed out a log of my watch data, weeks of readings, annotated in her precise handwriting to bring to the appointment. She walked into the living room and stopped. "Where's your watch?" she asked. "I took it off," I said. My wrist was irritated. Something crossed her face. It was fast, and she controlled it quickly. But I had spent 30 years reading the micro-expressions of patients who were frightened, and I did not miss it. "You need to keep wearing it," she said. "That's the whole point, Dad. Dr. Harmon needs continuous data." "Dr. Harmon has 8 months of data," I said. "I think he has enough." She set the groceries down on the counter. She began unpacking them, her back to me, and I watched her hands moving with that precise, efficient efficiency she'd always had. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. "I called Margaret Osei," I said. Claire's hands stopped. "I don't know who that is," she said. But her hands didn't move. "She's a cardiologist. She was in the park when I collapsed. She had some concerns about the watch." I paused. "She's having it evaluated by a colleague." Claire turned around. Her face was composed. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet and measured in a way that I now recognized as something other than calm. "Dad," she said, "some stranger approached you after you had a medical episode, and you gave her your medical device." "She didn't approach me," I said. "You don't know anything about her." I looked her up. She's exactly who she says she is. 30 years at Rush University Medical Center. Published research on cardiac monitoring devices. Claire looked at me for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone and set it on the counter, face down, and I understood the gesture she was deciding something. "I'm worried about you," she said. "That's all this has ever been. I'm worried about you living alone, not taking care of yourself, having these episodes and no one knowing." "Claire." My voice was gentle. "I need you to tell me what is in that watch." The silence lasted a long time. Long enough that I could hear the traffic from the street outside, the neighbor's dog barking twice and going quiet. Long enough that I understood, with a sorrow that settled over me like something physical, that she was not going to deny it. She sat down at the kitchen table. She put her face in her hands. What came out over the next 2 hours was not a villain's speech. It was not a dramatic confession. It was something more painful than either of those things. It was a story told in fragments, backtracking, justifications that collapsed before they were finished, silences that were louder than the words. Claire's husband, a man I'll call Derek, worked in biomedical engineering. He had, she said, modified the watch. The current it emitted was designed to cause exactly the symptoms I had experienced: gradual, plausible, consistent with age-related cardiac decline. The plan, as she described it with her eyes fixed on the table, was that I would become progressively dependent on her care, that I would come to see myself as incapable of managing alone, that eventually I would agree to move to Phoenix, to have her oversee my finances, my health care, my daily life. My wife had left me a significant estate, not a fortune, but a life's work in savings and a house in Lincoln Park that had appreciated enormously over 40 years. Claire was the sole beneficiary, but she was also the kind of person who planned ahead. And what she had understood, what Derek had apparently helped her understand, was that a father in good health, still competent, still independent, might at any time decide to revise that arrangement, to give to charities, to remarry, to establish a trust that served his own vision of his legacy rather than hers. The watch was insurance against that possibility. "I never wanted you to be hurt," she said, which was the sentence I kept returning to in the weeks that followed, because I didn't know what to do with it. I still don't. Entirely. I don't know how to hold the truth that someone can love you and harm you simultaneously, that those two things can exist in the same hands, in the same eyes that watched you across a kitchen table for 30 years and called you every single day. I called Howard that night after Claire had gone to her hotel. He answered on the first ring, as though he too had been waiting. Margaret Osei's colleague confirmed the modification within 10 days. The documentation she had gathered, combined with the records from Dr. Harmon's office records that showed a pattern of reported symptoms perfectly calibrated to keep me medicated and monitored, was substantial. I will not say the legal process was easy. I will not say there were not days when I sat in my living room in the early morning and felt something I am not ashamed to call grief. I loved my daughter. I raised her. I watched her become someone I admired, and I will never fully understand how admiration can curdle into something this cold, or what part of that loss is mine to carry. What I will say is this: Derek was charged with aggravated battery, causing great bodily harm, and criminal fraud. He was convicted on both counts. He is serving 6 years. Claire entered a plea agreement on charges of conspiracy and financial elder abuse. Her sentence included 5 years of probation, a substantial fine, and a permanent injunction against serving in any fiduciary capacity for me or my estate. She is not in prison. I made a choice about that. It is my choice to have made, and I have made peace with it. Mostly, the morning after the verdict, I got up early and walked to Riverside Park. I sat on my bench. I poured coffee from my thermos. The sky was that sharp November blue, the kind that looks like it could cut you if you touched it. A woman ran past with a golden retriever and gave me a small wave, the automatic friendliness of people who recognize each other from months of the same routine. My heart was steady. It had been steady since October, since I stopped the beta blocker under proper supervision and my real baseline reasserted itself, the baseline of a 63-year-old man who swam on Friday mornings and had been, before any of this, genuinely healthy. Howard met me there at 8. He brought bagels, which he knew I didn't eat, and ate both of them himself, while telling me about a paper one of his graduate students had written on the ethics of care and dependency. He talked too much and interrupted himself too often, and said 3 things that made me laugh out loud in the cold morning air. And I thought, this is the life I almost lost. Not the house, not the estate, not the abstract inheritance of what my wife and I had built together. This, Tuesday mornings, and bad bagels, and a friend who tells you uncomfortable things plainly because he respects you too much to do otherwise. I do not know how to advise you on the matter of trusting your children. I do not know what it looks like in your life, what history you carry, what love and fear are intertwined in those relationships in ways that are too specific to anything I can speak to from my own. What I can tell you is what a retired cardiologist told me, kneeling on the grass in September with her hands raised, that sometimes the thing making you sick is the thing you hold closest to your body because someone you love put it there. Take it off. Get a second opinion. Trust your own baseline. I stood up from that bench and walked home through the park, hands in my pockets, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely like myself. And that is something nobody is ever going to take from me again.